He is the founder and director of Spirit Equipped Ministries, is the author of 5 books, and serves as a conference speaker. I am so blessed to have Reverend Dr. David Chotka on my podcast today. He likes to go by Pastor David, so we're going to go by that.
Sure. You pronounced my name correctly, so kudos to you. It's a Ukrainian name. Now everybody in America knows about the Ukraine. They didn't used to, but now, yes, I'm 100% pure blood on both sides.
Let's get us going. Where are you originally from? Where'd you said that you grew up in Canada. What part of Canada? That's a massive country.
Well, actually, no, that's an easy question because Americans and Canadians share the same thing. I grew up just north of Niagara Falls. And so I was 12 miles north of Niagara Falls, and the town I'm from is a city called St. Catharines. And it was always sort of like the wannabe Niagara Falls. It's like all the tourists would go 12 miles south, all the business would go 12 miles south. But it was really what you call the Rust Belt. It was a GM town. It was a General Motors manufacturing center, and it was in what's called the Golden Horseshoe, which encompasses the little part of Lake Ontario that leads into Toronto. Toronto is a city of 7 million, and all of the people from St. Catharines all the way north live there and commute. So I grew up in that.
Now, did you grow up in a religious household, or was this something that you discovered later on?
Well, I didn't discover it; it discovered me. So I did.
Beautiful.
No, it was not a religious household. I will tell you though, there was this pastor who always came to my parents' restaurant. My parents ran a restaurant, and he would always show up if anybody was in trouble. And he guilted my parents into showing up in that church because he'd always show up with the guy didn't care. He didn't care if you were a prostitute or if you were a multimillionaire. He didn't care if you were poor or rich, if you smelled bad or if you looked pretty. He didn't care. He would just show up and sit with people who were in any age or stage of life. And if they were in trouble, you called him in the night, he'd get out of bed and go. So that man influenced my parents to consider being part of that church. And actually that church was right next to a hospital, and he would visit in the hospital and people would just show up after that. And that's how his church grew. So in the course of time, I was attached to that congregation, although I didn't really have a vital dynamic relationship with God until I met a bunch of people who talked about the claims of Christ and told me about this. And that's a very long story for a half-an-hour podcast. So it's not.
So now that you're a pastor, do you look back on that and use that as kind of a guide for how you pastor in your own denomination and your own teachings?
Well, there's a whole lot of markers along the way. I've been mentored by it's funny you should ask this. So I started in that church, didn't want to be there. I wound up by divine appointment going back there, and they launched me. But my mentors and my roles have been people who were seasoned pastors and leaders in many different traditions, who had local church and international connections at the same time, who became writers. And, some of the most amazing things, these famous people would visit me. I'd meet them. The first one was a guy named John White. He wrote 21 books. He was the founder of the university in Latin America. And he was one of their principal authors. He wrote 2 books that changed my life. One was called The Fight. The other was called Daring to Draw Near. And there's a hilarious story about how I met this guy. But he was praying about mentoring a poor pastor with no resources while I was praying about inviting someone like him to come to my church. And I wound up calling him out of the blue, and he said yes, because he had sensed the Lord was commanding him to fly into some poor little church and mentor the local pastor there. And that was me. So Dr. John White came to my church with his wife at no charge. And he was there for 5 days. He was a doctor of psychiatry, a church planter, a medical missionary. And he just took me on, and it was the most amazing thing. But he was a local church pastor who wrote. And the next one who inspired me was Dr. Gordon Fee, on faculty at Regent College. He was a local church pastor who became a New Testament scholar and wrote. And then the next one was a guy named Maxie Dunham, and he was a local church pastor who became a writer. And Maxie and I have actually co-written this book on healing prayer. But all the mentors, all the friends, there were others as well, but all of them were local church pastor with a global view, who would write things and travel and teach and do conference ministry. And, when this happens to you, you start looking at your mentor and saying, I want to become like them. That's what happens. And in the course of time, it was so many of them. We're talking, those are the 3 famous ones. There were others who did that as well. And so you see the trajectory of your life going in a particular direction when you trip into these kinds of divine appointments. Yes. But to co-write with my mentor was astonishing. The guy is 89. He's 89 years old. He has 89th birthday, and he co-wrote this book on healing prayer with me. And he's co-written with nobody else. He's written 50 books. I'm the first co-writer with him. So
My gosh.
that's an honor. Yeah, that's an honor. It's an
Wow.
amazing gift to have that happen.
So I always love having different pastors in different denominations on my podcast. I've had several from several different backgrounds all across the world, and it's been so much fun just to sit and have a conversation because you guys always have the best stories.
Okay, fair enough.
And your book has just fascinated me since the second you reached out to me as a potential guest for being on the podcast. I love this. I love the cover. So let's talk just a moment about your book and about the cover of your book here, because I understand that the gold being filled into the cracks, but a lot of people might not understand the reference there. They might not understand what that means.
It's striking because everybody that I've talked to who's seen the cover has the same response. And some people cry when they see it. Because it means that the broken, smashed vessel has been repaired and is more precious after it's repaired than it was before. And this amazing thing has happened. And so that picture came about because the people at the publishing company prayed, and the picture popped into the head of the graphic artist, and she put it there. And I had a different cover in mind, to be blunt with you. And then I saw that one. And the message of that picture is, God can take even what is ruined and smashed and destroyed and turn it back into not only its original purpose, but giving it far more value after it's been redeemed. And so the gold fills the cracks. It's not just glue, it's gold. And it creates this beautiful thing. It's a Japanese art form that's I don't remember the name of the art form, but
so off the top of my head. I don't remember.
Yeah, anyways, I attend a local church here, and I'm no longer a lead pastor, so I attend a church. And I gave a copy of the book just as it came out to the couple, the husband and wife, and the lady cried. She said, "That's my life. I've been broken, and God has poured gold into my wounds, and I'm healed." And that's what the book is about. It's about restoring. It's about people who are broken, whether it's mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, whatever the issue of the day happens to be. It's about God's power to restore. It's about God's power to heal. Oh, by the way, it's about me tripping over the ability to be able to be a part of that. Because I must tell you, I had no training in this whatsoever, no skill, no training whatsoever. Wow. It was something that was granted to me when I wasn't expecting or looking for it. There was a fellow who used to make fun of my faith. I was in this seminary, and I'd say something about the Bible being true, and he was a marvelous comic. He would make a joke, cause the whole room to laugh, and I was the object of the humor. And this went on, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 classes, and then you say to yourself, "That man and I are not going to be friends." So one day I was walking across the plaza, and there was a lovely Christian lady there. I call her Susie in the book. That's not a real name, but I call her that. And she was one of these do unto others as you would have them do unto you, kind and gentle people who showed up whenever anybody was in trouble. Anyway, this girl sees me and says hello. And I said, "How you doing?" She said, "I'm fine, but you know about our comic friend?" I said, "What?" He said, "We see that hospital 6 blocks down the road." I said, "Well, I see the hospital. What about it?" She said, "Well, he's in there." I said, "Oh, actually, I didn't feel bad." Then I had to repent of my bad attitude. Anyway, what happened was she that was her friend, and she said, "Well, I went to see him. He's got phlebitis." I said, "Oh, what's that?" She said, "That's a clot in his arm, and if the clot breaks free and travels through the bloodstream, it'll land in the lung or the brain, and 95 times out of 100, it'll kill you."
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, is he receiving good care?" And she said, "Yes." And then she said the crazy thing that changed my life. She said this. She said, I went to see him, and he asked me to ask you something." I said, "Oh, okay, what's that?" "He wants to know if you'll come and pray for him, that he might become healed." I said, "Well, wait a minute. He spent months making fun of my faith and mocking me to our peers." So I was afraid of the mockery. But the other thing was, I'd never met anybody who'd been healed by the prayer of faith, and I'd received no training in this. And so I was greener than your average rookie. And the only thing I'd seen was the crazies on television slapping people on the forehead and shouting with throwing hankies in the air. And I didn't think that was a helpful model. So anyway, what happened was, she said, "He wants you to come." And I said, "I'm not going because he's been cruel." And she stopped. And this is a kind girl who never spoke poorly of anyone. And she said, "You're right. He has. I will talk to him." I said, okay, but I'm not going. So away I went to my class. The next day I saw her in the coffee lounge, and she said that he had repented. He was sorry. And would I come? And I said, I'm not going. the third time I see her in the same plaza, I'm going to a repeat class. And she sees me and she said, did you go and see our friend in the hospital? I said, I'm not going. Now, you got to know this. It was like being told off by my mother. She got the fire in her eyes. She said my name out loud, and she used my middle initial as she stomped her foot. And she looked at me and she said, David R. Chotka, aren't you going around this school telling everybody the Bible's the word of God and it's supposed to be obeyed? I said, yes. And she said, well, how about this scripture? I was sick and you visited me. I thought, oh no. I'm going to have to go and visit the guy who's made fun of me. I'm going to have to go. So anyway, I on a sheer obedience to that teaching, I went. But I said to the girl, look, it says sick and visited. It doesn't say sick and prayed. She said, well, he wants you to pray. I said, well, I'll go and visit. I don't know how to pray. So I go to the 6 blocks down the road and go into the hospital room. And he's wired for sound. We're talking, monitors and pills and nurses coming in and out with pads of paper writing notes. And he's pale as a ghost and he's scared. And I go in there and I talk about the weather. Because I didn't know what to do. And then we talked, and then I asked about his courses, and he said, oh yeah, I'm keeping up. And I said, well, I visited you, now I'm going to go. He said, now wait, aren't you going to pray? I said, every time I've spoken about the power of God to heal or the miracles of Jesus or something has to do with the Bible, you've made fun of my faith. Why, in the name of all that is holy, do you want me to pray for you? And he said, he cried. The man, this 27-year-old man, burst into tears and began to cry, great volumes of tears. And then he said, I'm so sorry I did that to you. I'm just so sorry, but I have phlebitis. If that clot breaks free, I'll die. I don't want to die. Won't you please pray? You're the only guy I know who actually believes in this stuff. Won't you please pray that Jesus heal me? What are you going to do? I mean, so but I still had not a clue what to do. And then I remembered, oh yeah, the Bible says Jesus put his hands on people. So I went around, I said, where's the phlebitis? He said, left arm, just above the elbow. Can I put my hand there? He said, yes. I put my hand there, put the other hand on his head. And this was the moment that changed my life. This was the DNA of this healing prayer book. As I started to pray, suddenly it was as if the whole room was filled with fire and compassion in the air. And it was like I was inhaling compassion, and a hot tear in the corner of my eye, and focus, absolute clear focus on this man. And suddenly a conviction in my deepest soul that God himself wanted this man well. And I'd never done this before. And I started to pray this fumbling, mumbling, bumbling prayer. Oh, God, heal this guy. I don't know what I said. I'm sure it was a very awkward prayer. Anyway, as I did that, my whole being filled up with that fire, and the fire flowed through my arm, went into his arm. And then he said, what is that fiery presence flowing into my body? I said, that's the Spirit of Jesus granting you a healing. And then, Amanda, I ran out of the room because I had never felt anything like that before. Never. And I didn't know if he was going to mock me. I was still scared of that, but I had never felt that before. And so the next day I'm in the school and he's there. And I said, you're here? He said, I am. And then he pulled me into a corner and looked in all directions to make sure nobody was around. And then he looked me in the eye and he said, that prayer changed my life. I said, thank you. And I ran away again. Because I was then the next class, when I defended something from the Bible, the guy stood up and threw the humor grenade into the middle of the room looking for his laughter explosion. And he made fun of not believing. And everybody in the room began to laugh at not believing. And from that point forward, right through to the end of the term, he defended me. Now, the part that's not in the book is what happened afterwards. So, I mean, 2 months. So, second year, we're coming back. He sees me, and we're at a party. And there's his wife, who's a lovely lady, and there's the lady who asked me to come, and they're talking. And I walk up to them, we're having a chat, and the two girls start giving him the elbow. And they said to him, you got to tell Chotka what happened. Tell Chotka what happened. He said, I don't want to tell Chotka what happened. And then he said, oh, okay, I'll tell him. And then here's what happened. When I left the room, the nurse walked in. And he said to the nurse, I can go home now. Jesus is my friend from the Bible school came and prayed for me. And the nurse said, we don't do that around here. We got to run some tests. And he said, well, run them. She said, well, I was coming to get you. You're due anyway. And away he went for the tests. All the phlebitis was gone from his body. He was released that night. And so he went home and told his wife, and of course, she's extremely thankful. He's extremely thankful. And he did something he wasn't used to doing. They knelt down beside their bed and they prayed a prayer of thanksgiving. And then in the night, he had a dream. And in the dream, he sensed the voice of God saying, my servant David defends my word, and none stand with him. When he defends my scripture, defend him. And he said that, and he was on the verge of tears, and he couldn't stand that, so he cracked a joke, and he said this: the only time I ever got a phone call from God, it was for you. Then everybody started laughing, you know. But 30 years after this, 30 years, we lost touch because I went to a different denomination, but I was in touch with him. He's retired now. But he said, I remember it's the anniversary. Jesus healed me of phlebitis. Thank you for praying. He said that 30 years later. Wow. That's the beginning of my searching to understand how prayer for healing works.
My goodness.
That's the first story in the Healing Prayer Book.
Oh, what a powerful start that is.
Yeah, I must tell you, it's like I fell on a rock and wanted to swear, and I saw that I broke my head on a diamond. That's how it feels, you know, this crazy kind of thing, because I wasn't looking for that. All I was trying to do was study and get my job done and become a local church pastor. And I would trip into these miraculous divine appointments. Now, I must tell you, in the book, I'm not one of these guys who believes that everybody gets healed. I'm a guy who believes that you pay attention to the increase or the withdrawing of the presence. And what I describe to you is paradigmatic for the whole book. I talk about cooperating when the presence lands on you. And when you do that, the power of God can flow through you to accomplish amazing things.
How did you meet your wife? Tell me a little bit about her story.
Oh, that's funny. It's just funny. Okay, so I had a broken heart. The girl I wanted to marry married somebody else. She had a broken heart because the guy she wanted to marry married somebody else. And we wound up, there were 3 or 4 people moving to Vancouver, and 3 of us got together to save money, and we didn't know each other, right? So I knew the lady who was going to be your roommate, and I was moving to the same area, and so we moved this stuff. And I showed up on the move day, and I was supposed to be there to help them get the stuff in this place and then guide the driver to my home, et cetera, et cetera. But here's what happened. This is fun. So the guy didn't show up, and all my living stuff was in that moving van, and I had my sleeping camping gown. That's all I had, camping stuff. And she had nothing either. All her stuff was in that moving van. So it's in Vancouver back in the day, and there were no cell phones. And so we wound up standing outside a construction zone with a wraparound phone thing, calling her dad to say, be in touch with the moving company. The thing's not here. Because the plug-in phones were not there. We didn't have cell phones. So the plug-in phones were in the moving van. Anyway, the bottom line was this moving truck didn't show up for days. And so her cousin, who'd helped her to move in, went back to Edmonton, where she was from. And the other roommate had to stay in the town in Alberta I had come from, wasn't there. And so there was me and this single lady in this empty apartment for 10 consecutive days waiting for a moving van. And you got to know, I mean, my heart was broken. And at that point in the game, I looked at her at about day 5. I looked at her and said, listen, you need to know something. I wanted to marry a girl. She married somebody else. And I do not want to see anybody with a skirt on whose voice is higher than mine. All I want to do is get myself well. I'm licking my wounds. I'm not well. I'm not interested in a girlfriend. Thank you very much. And she heaved a big sigh of relief, told her side of the story. She had been actively pursued and stalked by this ugly guy. And so she had to get out of the way. That she had to call the police on him, et cetera, et cetera. And she was not interested in anything with a lower voice and a pair of pants on. And she said, I got 2 sisters. I don't understand men. I said, well, I got 2 brothers. I don't understand females at all, you know. And I said, I need a sister. And she said, I need a brother. I said, good, that's what's done then. So we waited 5 more days. We moved our stuff in, and then we were both at the same school. And here's what happened. There was a girl named Margaret who was a special education teacher, and my wife-to-be was a special education teacher. They sat down beside each other. They looked at each other and said, we have a career in Dr. Seuss, and this is complex stuff. What are we going to do? So the girl named Margaret wanted prayer with someone from my denomination, a pastor. And so she said, and so Elizabeth said, well, there's a pastor over there. That's him. He's from your denomination. So this girl, Margaret, walked over, And I started to pray with her, and the power of the Lord landed on Margaret, just landed on her. It was profound. And in the end, she went all over the school and started telling people, oh, if you want prayer, get David and Elizabeth to pray for you. So I'd walk in the school and they'd say, would you pray for me? I'd say, yes. Where's Elizabeth? Oh, I don't know. And so we wound up doing this thing, and we founded a prayer meeting, became friends. In over 2 years, we realized we needed to marry. I see we've got 33 minutes, 9 minutes. Okay, there we go. So anyway, the bottom line was, it was totally unexpected. And what happened was some of those miraculous acts of power began to happen there too. So, so people would come and ask me to pray with them, and I would pray with them. And sometimes it would be a physical healing. Sometimes it was emotional transformation. Sometimes a major decision would happen. But all over the school, all these people started talking about David and Elizabeth as prayer partners. And I mean, we were just standing there. I wouldn't pray with a female alone, so I asked her to help. And I'd been stuck in a room with her for 10 days, trying to escape the reality that I was in a room with a single female when I didn't want to even see one. And the next thing, so we become, convenience friends, followed by partnership in prayer, followed by friends who just hung around because it was nice. And everybody in the school thought we were dating, and we weren't. I actually prayed with Elizabeth about who I should take out. I did. And she told me, that's a nice girl. Be careful, because, this one's a nice one too. You might want to. Then she realized first that she cared for me. And she told me. And then I had to figure out this, because I didn't want to lose my very best friend. Yeah. And I had to navigate my emotions, because I was still raw from wanting to commit myself and losing that. And it was all said and done. We realized we needed to marry, and there's a lot more to the story. I'm trying to keep this as short as I can. So she was from a delightful Christian home, and her mom was a believer. Her dad was a believer. Her two sisters were believers. I walked, and I was a new convert. I was the first in my home, first Christian in my home. And so it was a gift to come into a family where that was the culture. It was the ordinary thing. Yeah. Some of my earliest memories were my two aunts ran a strip joint. My dad was a bouncer in that bar. I had to decorate the Christmas tree in the strip joint. And so she made little popcorn decorations and decorated the tree and sang Christmas carols. So our first fight when we got married was a Christmas tree, my first fight. I did not want one, and she wanted one. For her, it was joy. For me, it was despair, Yeah. And so the backgrounds are very different.
And now I understand that you do have a part of your book that you would like to read for us. I want to make sure that we have time for that. Have you got that handy?
I do have it handy. It's the story of a lady who, I met her 3 years after she said she was going to be dead. Okay, so the amazing story. Her name is Susan, and I have her written permission. She belongs to Heritage Park Alliance Church, where I served as the lead pastor for 5 years. And this is her story. She was healed from pancreatic cancer. So I had just arrived in Windsor. She shows up in the office and she said, Pastor, I'm widowed. My future husband is widowed. Would you do the wedding? And I said, I'd be delighted. She said, I was never expecting this to happen. I thought you'd be doing my burial, not my wedding. So let me read the story. Shortly after arriving at my congregation, I, David, was granted the privilege of performing a wedding ceremony for 2 retirees. When I met the bride to schedule preparations, our conversation landed on something remarkable. Susan shared that she had never thought she would see her wedding day because she'd been diagnosed with a notorious, aggressive kind of pancreatic cancer and had been planning her funeral. She said she was told that on average, less than 10% of people with pancreatic cancer survive. If the cancer metastasizes, the survival rate is close to 0. Susan had received all the medical treatments available to her, including chemotherapy and invasive medical procedure that was her last best hope. Then came the devastating news. The cancer had metastasized. It had spread into her lungs and other internal organs. Even the specialist could do nothing. She was told that she might live 3 to 6 months under the best circumstances. 3 months was the timeline when she went untreated, perhaps as long as 6 months if she received aggressive chemotherapy. Most diagnosed with this particular form of cancer die a rapid and painful death. But for Susan, the outcome would be different. She belonged to a small Bible study, and she asked a couple of its members who were elders in the congregation if they would consider anointing her with oil to pray for her healing. She also asked several friends who were strong, faithful believers, and so they were gathered together on Sunday, February 5, 2012, the day after World Cancer Day, which is held to raise awareness for the dreaded disease, to ask God for mercy. The request was more than serious. It was life or death. Everyone in the room loved Susan. They followed the leading they had, anointed her forehead with oil, and then at her invitation, everyone in the room gently placed their hands on her and began to pray. As Susan told the story of what had happened during that remarkable prayer time, her eyes filled with tears. Her friends and the two church elders placed their hands on her to intercede before the Lord. Susan had trouble trying to put the experience into word. Her entire body filled with God's presence. I asked her to describe it. She struggled for words and finally said, it was a combination of growing fiery heat and the peace that passes understanding. That presence gradually encompassed her entire body as she sensed within that God was actively healing her. Suddenly, she simply knew it was done. Like the woman with the issue of blood, she felt it in her body. The prayer time was gentle, not demanding or pushy. God's presence within turned into a simple assurance that it was completed. She simply knew beyond all knowing that God had done it. Susan was healed. I wish I had been there.
I lost a friend a couple years ago to pancreatic cancer, but he defied the odds for 7 years.
7 is unusual. It's usually 2 years, sometimes 3 months to 6 months, depending on how far the cancer has progressed. There's more in the account where her friends describe what it was like. I interviewed 4 of the 5 people in that room. Do you want to hear the rest, or have you got time for that?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Grace was given. Years later, I was granted the privilege of meeting several of those who were in the room during this healing prayer for Susan. I asked them to describe what they sensed as they prayed. Her friends remarked on the very same thing. As they began to pray for Susan, their bodies were filled with God's presence, which felt like a combination of fire, peace, and joy. 2 of her female friends were filled with complete conviction, a gift of extraordinary faith. They were utterly convinced that for God's glory, Susan must be made well. God's presence filled them, then spilled over into their friend as they asked God to touch her body and remove the cancer. One of the 2 elders testified that he sensed sudden filling as they all placed their hands on her shoulders. They were overwhelmed with an awareness of the majesty of God, brimming over with the love of Christ for their friend. The elders, her 3 friends, and Susan herself all spoke of a shared experience as they placed their hands on her and prayed. They sensed peace, fiery warmth, compassion, and a holy conviction, a certain knowledge. They all suddenly knew that God was at work in her body, healing her of terminal cancer. Together, collectively, Susan and everyone else in the room received the overwhelming sense that the matter was done. She was healed. Now, in the book, I unpack what that feels like, how you do it, and where it goes, and what you do with this. Do you cooperate with the medical community? You take a stand. And so the book itself contains a follow-up process. I tease out from that interview what it was like internally, what it was like in their mind, and what they were supposed to do in terms of organizing around healing prayer in the church.
I love this. I love your book. I'm going to make sure that I have the contact information for people to be able to go to spiritequip.com so that they can get your book and they can see everything that you've got there, because it's more than just your book you have on your website, of course.
Oh, yes. And now this book is available anywhere books are sold. You can go to Barnes & Noble, you can go to Books A Million, you can go to Amazon if you want to, or you can go to Walmart. You can get it at Walmart if you want to. It's just anywhere books are sold, because it's published by Whitaker House, which is an international publishing house. And so it's easily available for anybody who wants to purchase it. Just Google Healing Prayer and you'll find it. It's a co-write with Reverend Dr. Maxie Dunham. He is an accomplished author of more than 50 books. And so I'm very thankful for the partnership in prayer and in writing.
Absolutely. Well, Pastor David, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate you and appreciate your time, and love your message for the world.
Thank you, and God's blessing, and thanks for inviting me.
If you've enjoyed tonight's episode, please make sure you check out the episode description. You'll find links there on how you can learn more about this guest, links to connect with them on social media, and how to support the podcast. Remember, I don't get paid to do this. My boss is a bit tight-fisted, but I can say that. I work for myself.